Welcome again to this presentation on pragmatics. This time around, we'll be looking at the topic deixis. Deixis is derived from a Greek word which means to point. Deixis is an important field of language study in its own right, but it also has relevance to the analysis of conversation, and it has some relevance to pragmatics. And in fact, it is from the perspective of its relevance to pragmatics that we're going to take time to look at this topic called deixis. The bottom line here is that we want to appreciate that language can encode features of context within itself. Now, this phenomenon that encodes features of context in language is what is called deixis. It is often best described as verbal pointing, and that is pointing by means of language. So, as we already saw from the origin of the word, that initially it's coming from a Greek word which means to point. Deixis is about verbal pointing by means of language. Now, the linguistic forms of this pointing are called deictic expressions. Sometimes they are called deictic markers or deictic words. Sometimes they are called indexicals. So whatever word is used, whether indexicals, whether it's deictic words, deictic expressions, deictic markers, or what these words are referring to are those linguistic forms that are going to be used to point. Deixis is clearly tied to the speaker's context. The most basic distinction being between near the speaker, which is proximal, and away from the speaker, distal. Proximal deictic expressions include such words as this, here, and now. You can actually see that whenever you say this, or whenever you use the word here, or indeed the word now, it has to do with something being closer to the speaker. And that is what is being referred to as proximal. Distal deictic expressions include such words as that, there, and then. As you can see, these words are respectively the direct opposite of the examples that we had earlier, because that, there, and then show some distance away from the speaker, and so we're referring to them as distal deictic expressions. Proximal expressions are generally interpreted in relation to the speaker's location, which is also called the deictic center. For example, the word now is taken to mean some point or some period in time that matches the time of the speaker's utterance. And that's what we mean when we say proximal expressions are generally interpreted in relation to the speaker's location. Let's look at more examples of deictic expressions. Personal or possessive pronouns. All those personal or possessive pronouns that you know. For example, I, you, mine, yours. All these are deictic expressions. Demonstrative pronouns like this and that, used as demonstrative pronouns. Spatial or temporal adverbs. For example, here, there, now. Personal or possessive adjectives such as my or your. Demonstrative adjectives, this and that. All these are examples of deictic expressions. The bottom line being that deictic expressions have something to do with pointing. So deixis generally refers to the world outside a text. Reference to the context surrounding an utterance is often referred to as primary deixis, or exophoric deixis, or simply deixis. Primary deixis is used to point to a situation outside a text, otherwise known as situational deixis, or to the speaker's or hearer's shared knowledge of the world, otherwise referred to as knowledge deixis. Now that's what primary deixis is used to point. Contextual use of deictic expressions is known as secondary deixis, or textual deixis, or endophoric deixis. It's up to you to choose which term you're going to use, but all these refer to contextual use of deictic expressions. Such expressions can either refer backwards or forwards to other elements in a text. By talking about this, probably what should come to your mind is cataphoric or anaphoric type of reference, which also talked about referring backwards or forwards to other elements in a text. And those are exactly the same terms that we are going to use in this topic. Anaphoric deixis is backward pointing and is the norm in English texts. Most English texts use anaphoric type of deixis. Examples include personal and demonstrative pronouns: he, this, such, said, similar, same. All these are examples of anaphoric deixis, or the type of deixis that normally or usually does backward pointing. On the other hand, cataphoric deixis is forward pointing within the text. Examples to this effect include such words as the following: certain, some. Let's use some in a sentence. When the sentence goes like, the speaker raised some objections, and then it continues. In that particular case, some is a deictic expression which is pointing forward. The referent is going to come ahead of the text. The same applies with this as a word, as in the sentence, let me say this, and then it continues. Let me say this. This, in this particular phrasing, is also a deictic expression which is pointing forward. So all these words, including these, several, used in a way that they are pointing forward, become deictic expressions under the category of cataphora. Consider the following sentence. I gave her the dress. That is the sentence. I gave her the dress. Here, I and her can only be interpreted in physical context, right? I and her are therefore deictic expressions. Thus, most of the deictic expressions can be interpreted through pointing. You can only know the referent of a deictic expression through pointing. And that is why at the beginning of this particular presentation we said deixis as a word actually means to point. It's originally coming from a Greek word which meant to point. Let's consider one more statement. I gave her the parcel. I will also give that to you, you, and you. Are we able to know who are being referred to as the you in this particular sentence? Obviously not. One may not be able to interpret the pronouns unless he or she is within the physical context where this particular utterance has been made. And so this qualifies you as a deictic expression. Right. I hope by now you should be able to know the meaning of deixis and the examples of deictic expressions. If that is the case, we are moving on to categories of deixis. Now, deixis is divided into a number of categories as follows: person deixis, temporal deixis, place deixis, social deixis, discourse deixis, and empathetic deixis. What we're going to do in the next slides is to look at each one of these categories of dexes in much more detail, beginning with person dexes. Person dexes basically involves the speaker, marked by pronoun I, known as the first person, the addressee, marked by pronoun you, also known as the second person, and other significant participants, known as third persons. So all the third person pronouns that you know, he, she, it, apply in this particular case. Now, the choice of one of these forms instead of another because of the surrounding social circumstances is sometimes described as social dexes. This is a very important point. I'd want you to understand it. We are saying where the choice of one of these forms instead of another, for example, if you choose to use third person pronoun instead of second person, and that your choice is based on the surrounding social distance or social circumstance, then it qualifies to be described as social dexes. An example of social contrast involving person dexes could be the distinction between forms used for a familiar person versus an unfamiliar person in some languages. What we're saying here is there are situations in some languages where there are certain forms that are going to be used if you're talking to a person that you're familiar with, and that other forms are going to be used for persons that you're not familiar with. This is known as the TV distinction. This phrasing, TV distinction, is emanating from the French tu, which is a pronoun used to refer to people that you're familiar with, and vous, which again is a pronoun, but used in the case where you're not familiar with the person that you're talking to. So using the T from tu and the V from vous, linguists have coined this particular term TV distinction. This TV distinction is also found in some other languages such as Spanish, Italian, and German. The bottom line here is forms being used to refer to people depending on whether you are familiar with that particular person or not. Now, the choice of one form communicates something about the speaker's views or his or her relationship with the addressee. The use of third person pronouns where second person would be possible indicates distance. This can be done in English for an ironic or humorous purpose. An example would be where, let's say, one person is so busy in the kitchen, whereas another person is simply being lazy, lying down in the living room. So the person in the kitchen may say, "Would His Highness like some coffee?" instead of, "Would you like some coffee?" So you can see here that by saying, "Would His Highness like some coffee?" instead of, "Would you like some coffee?" there is an indication of distance here. But of course, in this particular case, this person in the kitchen is sarcastically bringing the distance. This example has been extracted from Yulee in his book Introduction to Language, which was published in 1996. Now, the distance associated with third person forms can also be used to make accusations. Let us look at this example where third person form has been used to make an accusation. The statement, "You haven't washed your cup," becoming, "Somebody hasn't washed her cup." You haven't washed your cup becoming, "Somebody hasn't washed her cup." Apart from accusations, you can also make a potentially personal issue seem like an impersonal one based on a general rule using third person pronouns. Look at this particular example. Each person has to wash his or her cup after having coffee. This statement is said instead of a statement that would have gone like, "You have to wash your cup after having coffee." By saying "you have to wash your cup after having coffee," it sounds more personal, unlike saying each person has to wash his or her cup after having coffee, because The second statement sounds more of a rule than an order to a person. English does not use personal dexes to indicate relative social distance in the same way that other languages do. However, the pronoun we in English has the potential for ambiguity. That is, between we, which is exclusive, we're talking about where we excludes the hearer, and we, which includes the hearer. This will be more clear if we put it in the context of an example. When somebody says, let us go, or simply, let's go, if this is said to some friends, you can see that here, we includes the hearer. In the second example, let us go, said to someone who is keeping the speaker and his or her friends prisoners. You see that we, in the second instance, excludes the hearer. Because in the second instance, this is more of begging. Let us go, please, let us go. The us there does not include the hearer, because the hearer is probably the one who is holding these people prisoners. Whereas in the first example, let us go, or let's go, say to friends, the hearer is included. So you can actually see that we in English has the potential for ambiguity. When you say, let us go, do you mean to include the hearer, or you mean to exclude the hearer? That is the ambiguity that we wanted to bring to your attention. So the last bullet here is simply to remind us that us is the objective form of we. Somebody may be worried that we are going to have an example to do with we, and how come we are using us in the sentences or the examples that we've given. So that is the explanation. Moving on to the next category of dexes, which is discourse dexes. This is reference to a portion of a discourse relative to the speaker's current location in that particular discourse. So reference which is being made to a portion of discourse relative to the speaker's current location in the discourse. Examples to this effect would be use of this to refer to a story one is about to tell. When you use the word this to refer to a story that you're about to tell, as in the following example. I bet you haven't heard this story. Here, how the word this has been used is to make reference to a portion of a discourse relative to the speaker's current location in the discourse. Another example would be where, let's say, reference to chapter 7 of a book by means of a phrase like in the next chapter or in the previous chapter, where such reference is made using such phrases, then it becomes discourse dexes, because reference is made to a portion of the text relative to the speaker's current location in the text. Now, within discourse dexes, there is what we call token reflexive dexes. Token reflexive dexes is discourse dexes in which the deictic expression that has been used is referring to the expression or speech act in which it is occurring. So this is a situation where a deictic expression is used to refer to an expression in which the deictic expression itself is occurring. An example would do more to clarify. Let us look at this one. I hereby apologize. Hereby is the deictic expression. And what is it referring to? It is referring to an expression in which the deictic expression itself is occurring. So the expression here is I apologize. And the word hereby is referring to the expression itself. And hereby as a word is also found in the expression itself. Such type of occurrences are what are referred to as token reflexive dexes. The next category of dexes that we're going to look at is spatial dexes. What is spatial dexes all about? The concept of distance is considered relevant to this type of dexes. Whenever relative location of things is being referred to or is being indicated. Contemporary English uses only two adverbs as spatial deictic expressions, and these ones are here and there. But there are also some verbs of motion, such as the verb come and the verb go, which retain a deictic sense when they are used to mark movement towards the speaker or indeed away from the speaker. For example, if somebody says, come to my room, focus on the role that the word come is playing in this particular sentence. Come to my room. You can actually see that come to my room is indicating some movement towards the speaker. The second sentence, go to my room. In the second sentence, you can actually see that what the word go is doing is to show movement, but this time around away from the speaker. And so where such verbs of motion are marking movement towards or movement away from the speaker, then they also become deictic expressions. The location from the speaker's perspective can be fixed mentally as well as physically. What do we mean by this? Speakers temporarily away from their home location will often continue to use here to mean the home location. So you may not be at your house or you may not be at your home, but you may end up using the word here when somebody is asking you about your location because you are temporarily away from it. So let's say your friend is visiting you at your home and he finds that you're not there and he calls you and says, but I'm at your place, how come I can't see you? And or you're saying, no, I'm here, where you're using the word here to mean home location and yet you are temporarily away from it. That is what we mean when we say the location from the speaker's perspective can be fixed mentally as well as physically. Now, that phenomenon is described as deictic projection, and we can make more use of its possibilities when technology allows us to manipulate location. For example, on an answering machine, say a ground telephone in the home, a person temporarily going away from the home can record the message below. I'm not here now, call me later. I'm not here now, call me later. Such a message is meant to be played whenever someone calls the landline while the homeowner is away. I want you to look at it again. Look at how the phrasing goes. I am not here now, call me later. I am not here now, call me later. Let us observe this. When you say I am not here now, if here means the place of the speaker's utterance and now means the time of the utterance, this sentence, I'm not here now, without this technology should be nonsense, isn't it? How can you say I'm not here now? Consider this statement without the technology issue. Let's say somebody is saying this to you, I am not here now. It doesn't make sense. However, answering machines can use such utterances thanks to technology that has allowed deictic projection. Remember, we are referring to this phenomena as deictic projection. So technology here is allowing the speaker to manipulate location. The basis of spatial deixis is psychological distance rather than physical distance. Usually, physical and psychological or metaphorical distance will appear the same. But the speaker may wish to mark something physically close as psychologically distant, as when you indicate an item of food on your plate with, I don't like that, instead of, I don't like this. The usage of that in that particular case is to show psychological distance. While we know that you're physically closer to the plate in which there is the food that you're talking about, you use the word that simply to communicate psychological distance. Moving on to the next category of deixis, empathetic deixis. This is the metaphorical use of deictic forms to indicate emotional or other psychological distance or proximity between a speaker and a referent. A good example to this effect is when somebody uses the word this to indicate the speaker's empathy. We hope you know the meaning of the word empathy, like to be genuinely sympathetic, or indeed the use of that as a word to indicate the speaker's emotional distance, where the word this or the word that has been used to show speaker's empathy or emotional distance, then that is what is referred to as empathetic deixis. The next type of deixis is temporal deixis. This is the last type of deixis that we're going to look at. This is also called time deixis. The words now and then are examples of deictic expressions in this category in English. But then, in contrast to the word now, the distal expression then can be used with both past and future time. For example, when you say, last Saturday night, I was at home with a friend then. Here, then has been used to refer to past. Let us look at the second example. Theater at 7 p.m. on Saturday? I'll meet you there then. Here, then has been used to indicate future time. In temporal deixis, we also use systems of non-deictic temporal reference, such as the calendar and the clock time. Otherwise, if we can't use the calendar and the clock time, in certain cases, we would not know if we have a short or a long wait ahead of us. Let's consider, I'll be back in an hour. If you don't know anything about clock time, are you going to know how much a wait it is when somebody says an hour? Obviously not. And that is why we are saying in this type of deixis, we also use systems of non-deictic temporal reference, such as the calendar and clock time. Another example would be free beer tomorrow. How long a wait is it going to be before tomorrow? You'll only be able to know how much waiting there is going to be if you have knowledge about clock time and calendar. Thus, one can only know the amount of waiting ahead if she has the knowledge of the calendar or the clock, just as we have already said. Also, verb tense indication is considered a type of temporal dexis in English. When somebody says, I live in Blantyre, this means presently the person is living in Blantyre. What about I lived in Mulanje? That communicates time, that it is in the past. And that is why we're saying verb tense indication is considered also a type of temporal dexis, because it is indicating something to do with time. The present tense is considered the proximal form, and the past tense the distal form. Something that took place in the past, or that is extremely unlikely from the speaker's situation, is marked via the distal past tense. I hope it is clear reaching this far. Psychological distance can apply to temporal dexis as well. How? We can treat temporal events as things that move towards us or into our view, or things that move away from us, out of our view. For instance, we speak of this coming year or the approaching year. This may stem from our perception of things which we see approaching, both spatially and in time. So we treat the near or immediate future as being close to the utterance time by using the proximal deictic expression this, as in this weekend, to mean the next weekend ahead. This weekend. When you say this weekend, what it means there is you're treating the coming weekend as something that is being closer to you in time. And that is why we're saying such phrases will also be referred to as proximal deictic expression. In this particular case, the usage of this is a deictic expression. Or when somebody says this evening, when this statement is said in the morning, this evening I'm coming to your home. Again, somebody is treating the immediate future as being close to the utterance time through the usage of the word this. This is where we end the presentation on dexis. What is important to note again is dexis is deriving from a Greek word which means to point. And the bottom line in this presentation is that language can encode features of context within itself. And what we've done is to look at these deictic expressions in terms of categories, from spatial to temporal to person to empathetic, and the other categories that we have looked at. Thank you. Our next presentation will be on presupposition.